Welcome to the Joys of Binge Reading, the show for anyone who ever got to the end of a great book and wanted to read the next instalment. We interview successful series authors and recommend the best in mystery, suspense, historical and romance series, so you'll never be without a book you can't put down. You'll find this episode's show notes, a free ebook and lots more information at thejoysofbingereading.com. And now, here's our show.
Tessa Lunney's party girl, Kiki Button, poses for Pablo Picasso in a Bohemian Paris that's the setting for the first of a mystery series that gently prods at serious questions, like how to be a modern woman. Hi there, I'm your host, Jenny Wheeler, and today Tessa talks about why she's obsessed with 1920s Paris, how her doctorate on war literature helped shape Kiki's character, and why Harry Potter saved her in the early days of motherhood. But before we talk to Tessa, just a reminder that the show notes for this binge reading episode can be found on the website thejoysofbingereading.com. That's where you'll find links to Tessa's website and books, as well as details about how to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. But now, here's Tessa. Hello there, Tessa, and welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Hi, how are you?
Excellent. Look, beginning at the beginning, was there a once upon a time moment when you decided you wanted to write fiction? And if there was there some sort of catalyst for it?
There was a moment that I decided I wanted to write fiction, and that was about 2 years after I realized I was never going to be an actress. I wanted to be an actress so much from when I was a very little girl, and then when I was about 21, 22, I realized that I didn't have the success that my friends who I'd been teen actors with had already had, but also it didn't suit me. It didn't suit my personality, didn't suit me intellectually. I looked at the decisions I'd made in my life and I went, none of these are pointing towards an acting life, Tessa. You have to be honest with yourself. You're not going to do this. And then a couple of years later, I finished university, and I did in Australia, it's the honours year, which is an extra year on the end of a 3-year degree, and I was surrounded by highly intelligent, passionate, eloquent book readers, and I thought, these are my people. These are my people. And so I thought, well, you're going to have to go with books. It was your first love and it's your true love. So maybe you can tell a story. Maybe you should start to try. And so I started to try. And when I enrolled in just a graduate diploma of creative writing, and I enrolled because my boyfriend at the time was enrolling in his Bachelor of Music, and I was bored and I had nothing better to do. And I did about 3 or 4 classes and went, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. So it was like a long moment that ended in a flash of revelation.
Great that you had such self-awareness at such an early age, really.
Well, it was sort of forced upon me because I was quite unhappy, trying to do this and trying to do that, and it was all failing and not working, and it should have worked. It worked in my mind, and I just couldn't perform. I couldn't do anything, and I tried out for drama schools and hadn't got in, and I just thought, this is a series of failures. But more than that, you don't even enjoy it. You're not even enjoying being up on stage. You don't want to do it.
Yes.
So
yeah.
What do you why are you pursuing this if actually you hate it? So I had to think about it. But it took a long time to think about it. I went overseas and I had affairs, and I finished my degree. I did a lot of thinking. The self-awareness came slowly.
Yes. So April in Paris 1921 is the name of the book, and it's kind of like we know about the Americans in Paris, but this one is an Australian in Paris. So your heroine is Kiki Button. What made you decide on the mystery genre and that time period?
So the time period was because I have been obsessed with it for about 10 years, since I read Among the Bohemians by Virginia Nicholson, who's Virginia Woolf's grand niece. My mother gave me that book just as I was starting my Masters of Creative Writing, and it was like a template for how to live the artistic life, how to be a writer and an artist in a world that seems to push you in the opposite direction. I've read it maybe 12 times, but since her book is so meticulously researched that after I read that book, I'd go through her notes and start reading all the books in the back of her notes that I could find and reading more books about the period. And as I was doing my doctorate, it was like my get out of jail free card when I could pretend I was researching but not really doing any work because it's set in that interwar period. So when I decided I wanted to write another book, it had to be 1920s Paris, because that's where I wanted to be myself in 21st century Sydney. As for the mystery genre, I've been very slow to get into it, but now that I am into it, I really love it. I love how it's such a tight framework, but because it's a tight framework, it can leave so much room for creativity and imagination, and for talking about both the past and the present and the relation between the two. But you have a way through. You have a way that you can use all of the material from the past or all of the material from the present to be able to weave a story that says something particular, because you can loop the story over the framework of the detective or the spy thriller.
Yeah.
There are certain things that need to happen.
Yeah. So it keeps it interesting, but at the same time, as you say, you can have a lot of that very enjoyable extra detail. Now, Kiki is the daughter of a wealthy wool baron. She enlists as a nurse in World War I while on holiday with relatives in England, and she can't settle back into the expected life for a young woman of a certain class after the war. I'm sure there were many young women who felt that way during that period. Tell me a little bit about the genesis, particularly for Kiki.
The genesis for a lot of this book came from the research I did whilst doing my doctorate in Australian war fiction.
Uh-huh.
So Kiki follows a template of many young men, many soldiers who couldn't settle back into a job, couldn't settle back into the sweet banality of ordinary life. Some of them loved it. It was exactly what they wanted, and others just the adrenaline of war and their having survived and the grief of having survived, but also the pleasure was just too much and they couldn't settle. And so Kiki follows that mold. But other than that, it actually came from my reading that I wanted to hear a particular type of voice. I wanted to have a particular type of narrator, a particular type of, could have been hero or heroine, but I was always going to write a heroine who would take me on a journey and talk to me in a particular way. And I searched and often and I couldn't quite find it. And so I thought, well, Tessa, you're a writer. You're going to have to write it if this is what you want.
Yeah, there's probably not many. There probably are memoirs of women who obviously were nurses in the war, but how honest they would have been about their life after the war in that time is probably a question. So a lot of it you would have had to have imagined rather than rely on memoir for. Yeah, I did. Well, the memoirs that I read were of the artists in Montparnasse. And so those women who'd chosen the life that Kiki chose to live, rather than the nurses who often, if they could leave Australia or England, then went home and they had a lot of other things to deal with in terms of the grieving families and grieving friends and ordinary life. There weren't a lot who made the leap from nurse to Bohemian, shall we say. Right. But I wanted to combine the two, so I decided that she would. Yeah. That's great. And in April in Paris, there's a lot of real history. I mean, that's one of the real pleasures of it, including a cameo role for Pablo Picasso. That fascinated me.
Well, he was the king. He was the king of Montparnasse. He was the king of the artists in Paris. So I thought, well, why not? She's just going to have to meet him. This is the kind of book that I wanted to read. I'd read so many histories, and it felt like looking through a window at a party and I couldn't come in, and I'm like, I want to be at that party. I want to be right in the middle of that party. So I wrote Kiki so that I could be right in the middle of that party. And yeah, I'd been reading about it for 10 years. So in some ways it was very straightforward for me to write Picasso in. I'd actually been reading about Picasso because his artistic work ethic is so phenomenal, and he painted every day and nothing interrupted him. And so I would read sort of biographies of him to try and work out how he did that, so I could work out how I could live an artistic life. But it meant that I just had a lot of material, and it was fun. And it was fun to address some of the things that can sometimes annoy me about reading history, like he was not very nice to the women in his life. So I could create a woman who could address that a little bit and maybe take advantage of that in the way that some of the women he was with couldn't take advantage of it. So it was super fun, and it's a super fun place to live in your imagination. And it was a joy to go, oh, who else was there? Oh, I mean, David, she was there with Jules Pachin, who was her lover. Oh, okay, I'm going to put that in. I'll put that in. And yeah, it was great.
A lot of fun, yes. Look, have you actually spent time in Paris yourself, very much time?
Not very much time, bit of time as a tourist, but not as much as some, and I certainly don't speak any French. But the Paris of 1920s is very different to contemporary Paris.
Yes.
So I don't feel that I'm missing out a lot, except in the way that Paris is set out in terms of the sounds and the smells of Paris. But it was 100 years ago, so that's okay. And the Paris that I'm talking about is really an Anglophone Paris. It's the Paris of the British and the Australians and the Americans, rather than the Paris of working class Parisians who'd just come back from the war. So there's a lot written about Montparnasse and Montmartre in the early part of the 20th century, and that's what I've been reading.
Yes. Possibly it also, as you've just alluded to, isn't exactly about the First and Second World War anymore. It's rather more about people who lived through that time. But that period, the World War I and World War II, has become very popular with mystery novels. And I wondered if you had any feeling for why that does appeal to readers now.
Well, I can only speak from my experience as a reader, which I find war and that interwar period sort of intellectually fascinating. There was so much change, so much political change and social change and cultural change, and we're still living the effects of those changes as well. We're still living the effects of, say, the Russian Revolution. We're still living the effects of what happened in World War II, that it's fascinating to go back and read about it and how individuals in that time might have made a decision to do one thing or not, or another, to join the resistance or to join the Communist Party or to become a nurse in World War I or to become an artist, and what motivated those decisions and how their small story related to the larger one. I'm very interested in that idea.
Yeah.
But also things like it's 100 years since the end of World War I. So there's a lot in the news, and there's a lot sort of online about looking back a century later, and so then that just keeps going, I guess. In terms of World War II, I think it's been fascinating since it began, and I don't think it's ever gone out of popularity, if you know what I mean. And so people have just then extended it back to World War I.
Yes, I spoke to a Canadian writer, M.K. Todd, who does World War I mysteries, and she had the feeling that Commonwealth readers and writers had a greater fascination for World War I because World War I was so much more significant for us, whereas the Americans very much were fixated on World War II. Have you found that in terms of audience and readership?
Well, this is my first book, and it only came out a few months ago, so I haven't quite had time to understand that.
Yeah.
But also because mine's set in 1920s, America is very interested in the 1920s, and especially the social and cultural changes of the 1920s and for women, and that's when those fabulous detectives like Marlowe started to be written and started to came out that confirmed the American mystery genre. So I haven't experienced that myself, but from my historical research, I would say then, yes, they're more interested in World War II than World War I, whereas, as M.K. Todd said, World War I and becomes a continuum with the interwar period, and then World War II, it starts to become one period rather than discrete wars and discrete time sections. So
yeah, it's rather shocking to think that it is now 100 years. It's suddenly, you don't realise it was quite that long ago until you're suddenly brought up short with that anniversary, that centenary.
Yes, well, especially as just a few years later, the 1920s, a lot of the literature and the art still feels so contemporary.
Yes.
Still feels so modern and boundary pushing in terms of modernism. But then you look at, like I would look at photos of World War I and you see the technology was so much less than it is today, just in the grainy photos, or you hear arguments against women being able to vote in the British Parliament from 100 years ago, and you think, whoa, that is a long time ago. So there's kind of this, for me, there's this kind of disconnect between what some sections of society were doing and then what other sections were doing.
Yeah, so that sort of brings up one of your themes. You say that one of your obsessions is how to be a modern woman, and that's definitely one of the things that Kiki is exploring, isn't it? How to be a modern woman.
Yes, I wanted to. Well, I think it's a very pressing issue still, and when with things like the Me Too movement coming up, the idea of what does it mean to be a woman in the world and what is femininity, if you can call it that, on a continuum between, you know, female sexuality and female biology and with transgender identity, all of these ideas of what it means to be a woman are being debated still. And this was a time, it had come up through the 19th century, but it was exploded in World War I with women doing men's jobs, in quotation marks. They were on the front line, they were driving ambulances, they were bus conductors and postmen at home and doing all these things. And then in the 1920s, both with the sort of social movement of the flappers going out and wearing makeup and being unchaperoned, and then the other sort of cultural movement of women having to work because they were never going to be able to get married. The men weren't there.
Yes.
And all the changes that had to happen because of what the war did. So, yeah, for me, Kiki can address our concerns now by being there at a beginning time addressing what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to be unchaperoned, and how do you deal with men who have very old-fashioned ideas? How do you create this life when there's no template?
Yeah, it gives the book a remarkably contemporary feel, and she feels like a woman that you could meet, right today. She hasn't got any sense of antiqueness about her at all.
Yeah. Well, I've had a couple of people say that Kiki is their friend. They feel like they found a new friend in Kiki. So
maybe even a heroine, yes, or role model. Yes.
I think she has maybe too many cocktails with famous artists who are now dead to be a true role model. But she's certainly a friend.
Yes, there might be a little bit of over-medication with alcohol, that's right, yes. I'm not sure if you believe in the idea of core story, or whether you've quite done enough writing yourself yet to have discovered what your core story was or is. But tell me a little bit, do you actually believe in that idea of a core story, and do you have a sense of what your core story would be? Is it something to do with women's finding their role in life?
I would have said writers have writerly obsessions.
Yes.
So a reader can stick with a writer because of their writerly obsessions, accord with what the reader is interested in the world, and it can be both in terms of form and style as well as content. And I would have said some of my writerly obsessions are to do with the intersection of history, memory, and identity around war.
Yes.
And so those ideas I keep coming back to. That's what I looked at in my doctorate, and what Kiki is looking at in an oblique but fun way. And then other books and other short stories that I've written look at it in a more serious or tragic way, that the way that history and memory, identity interact, but particularly through narrative, through the way that we structure narrative in order to come to terms with identity, in order to structure memory and history to be able to create identity. And these are the ideas. I don't think they have an answer, which is why I can come back to them again and again and again, and throw in a character like Kiki, or throw in an old man in Soviet Russia, or throw in a young woman who's been abducted, who runs away from an abduction, or some of the other short stories that I've written.
Yeah, yeah.
Whether that comes out as a core story, I'll have to wait and see. But they're certainly the ideas that I can't get rid of.
Yeah, yeah. That segues really nicely into expanding our discussion a little bit away from the particular book to look at your wider career as a writer. And as you've referred to, you are also a poet, a reviewer, and an academic. And your doctoral dissertation was, quotes, on the silence in contemporary Australian war fiction with a basis in trauma therapy. Now, as soon as I read that, and it was after I'd read the book, April in Paris, I realized that there is, well, I obviously already knew it, but I saw where the link was with Kiki's, because underneath all the gaiety, you do sense that there is trauma still there. Did you find it fascinating to link all that up?
Yes, in a word.
Yeah.
I read so trauma theory is a way of looking at particular types of narrative, and especially contemporary narratives, with the idea that there's a traumatic event, and this shapes the way the narrative is. And I'd read a lot of the theory, and then I read a lot of the books that seem to talk to the theory explicitly, but obviously a lot of them are quite dark.
Yes.
And quite tragic.
Yeah.
And it's beautifully written, but also sad. And I was pregnant, and then I was breastfeeding, and I needed to explore these ideas in a way that didn't make me quite so sad.
Yeah.
That wasn't quite so tragic. And to use for April in Paris, 1921, to use some of the previous generations' way of coping with war, which was through humour, and to try and use some of that to talk about these things. So yeah, there's this underlying sadness, trauma, difficulty. World War I, a lot of World War I books are about loss, about coping with unimaginable, sudden and destructive loss. And so then how to weave some of that into a narrative that also wasn't dark.
Yes.
It was quite a fun challenge, shall we say.
And the silence that's referred to, is that a silence where they found it very difficult to actually address they didn't actually talk about it directly?
Yeah, so silences in war fiction, it's an idea that relates to a lot of trauma theory. It's sort of the unsayable.
Yes, yeah.
I guess. So something that you would know but you cannot articulate, and it can be the way that I looked at it, it was anything from a missing person or a death to a traumatic event, or a pregnant pause, a pregnant silence, but also the way that professional writers would use this silence, use this ultimate incommunicable moment to give the narrative momentum, so that we as a reader can understand that there's an incredibly powerful force that's pushing these characters along that can't be said, and we have to understand what is inside this force, what propels this force through the structure of the narrative and through the language.
Sure. Yeah. I think you actually do that very well with Kiki. Look, perhaps just expanding a little bit further, is there one thing you've done in your career overall more than any other that's helped you progress?
Probably my doctorate.
Yes.
It's a big thing.
Yeah.
It's a big one thing, but my master's led into my doctorate, but having the the 3 years, and I got a scholarship as well, which was almost enough to live on. So I could really sit down and concentrate and read and write and read and write and talk to other people who were similarly obsessed with reading and writing and these ideas. And I did it at the Western Sydney University.
Yes.
And my supervisor, Professor Ivor Indick, is amazing, and he runs a publishing company, and all my peers are published authors and published poets. And so I was in this incredibly just a great environment of people giving me some of the best feedback that I could ever hope to have.
Yeah.
And I'm still sort of bringing up those lessons, sort of bringing up even 5 or 6 years later. My supervisor would have said something. I'm like, oh, that's what he means. I finally understand. And I just, that's probably the one thing. And it changed the way I thought about my writing. It wasn't a hobby or something that I did for myself alone. It was a professional thing and a public thing.
Yeah.
And I could work on it like work rather than like play. So, that changed my life.
Yes, it sounds like it was a very successful incubator.
It was.
If you were going to do a magical mystery literary tour of Kiki Button's Paris, where would you recommend people go? Can you still find the places that, some of them anyway, that Kiki lived and danced in?
Oh, how fun. What a fun thing to think about. You can find some, but not a lot, because places like Montparnasse were very poor, which means a lot of the places were sort of falling down. And then they had to be rebuilt. So I was actually in Paris this April, and I did my own little tour. And I first of all, I went to Montparnasse, and I just walked around the streets. I had a coffee at the Rotonde Cafe, and I had a coffee at the Dome Cafe, and walked around all of those streets and the cemetery. And so that would be the first place I would say to go. Secondly, I would say to walk up to the Seine, because Kiki does a lot of walking, and walk through the gardens and go to the Ritz at Place Vendôme. And I had a very delicious and very expensive cocktail at Bar Hemingway. So to do that as though you were there with Bertie, Kiki and Bertie, and to go and have a cocktail at the Ritz, and then just to walk along and find a little cafe and have a coffee and a croissant and a baguette and listen to the sounds of Paris and listen to the way that people speak French around you and what it sounds like. And if the cafe is tiny and it's full of old men playing chess, even better. A tiny little local place that nobody knows about. It's away from all of the tourist places. That's what I would say to do.
Yes.
That would take a day.
Yes, that
would take
wonderful.
a day, but you could do it. There are other great places to go, like the Picasso Museum, which I went to, which is nowhere that Picasso actually lived, but has a lot of his work that was related to Paris. And it's sort of round this little lane and down another little lane in a former school. And as you look out, you can look out onto all of these sort of apartments that are still in the middle of the city. And I think that's one of the things that Kiki loves and that I love about Paris through Kiki is that sort of people, there's not a separation between where you work and where you live. It's all together. So even in the center of town, you can find the local cafe because people are living 4, 5, 6 floors above it in little apartments.
Yeah.
And so just wandering around and finding little alleyways and finding little like 18th century confectionery stops that are still there.
Yes.
You know, it's like you discover your own Paris every time
Yes.
you go. Yeah. And so as I'm writing these books, I want Kiki to discover a new Paris every time.
Yes. Yeah. Look, turning to Tessa as reader, we called this series The Joys of Binge Reading. Are you a binge reader, and have you in the past binge read authors? And if so, who do you favour most?
I'm definitely a binge reader, but it's not only authors but also themes, shall we say.
Yeah.
So recently, in terms of authors, there's a few that I've gone through, and sometimes there's very particular reasons. So I was up about 5 or 6 times a night a couple of years ago when my daughter was teething and she wouldn't sleep. So I read all of Harry Potter. Bang, I read 5 or 7 in a month, only between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. So that was a type of binge reading that absolutely saved my life. And I thank J.K. Rowling for being such a brilliant plotter and being able to I think it was maybe the only book that I could have read that I would rather have finished the chapter than go back to bed. And I thought, well, that's some seriously good suspense writing. And so I've gone through her Robert Galbraith books as well, and the 4th one's just come out, the Strike and Ellicott novels.
Yes.
So they're great. I've also been binge reading things like Maisie Dobbs.
Oh yes,
because these are in the period, so that it's a fun binge reading because I can also pretend it's work. Yeah. So binge reading Maisie Dobbs, written by Jacqueline Winspear, and binge reading Solari Gentile's Roland Sinclair series.
Oh yes, yeah.
So she's an Australian author.
Yes, yeah.
But otherwise, it tends to be that there's a period or an idea that I get stuck on, and I just want to read as much about that as possible. So obviously, one period that I've been stuck on for a very long time is Paris, women in Paris between the wars. So I've read a book by Vincent Cronin called City of Light, which is nonfiction, and I've read another nonfiction called Les Parisiennes by Anne Seber about Parisian women during the occupation of World War II, and then just on and more and more. Another one by Dan Frank called Bohemian Paris, I think. And now so that's one sort of binge reading obsession that I'm going through. And then there's another one that's just started up, which is Russian literature of the early 20th century. So I'm currently reading Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak, and I've got Bulgakov's The White Guard next to me, and Vasily Grossman and Boris Akunin and all these other ones like that. So I kind of have 2 types of binge reading, both a character and from an author, as well as ideas. Oh, and I should also mention the one that obviously inspired Kiki first, which is Kerry Greenwood's Phryne Fisher novels.
Oh, yes.
Which is one of the reasons I started to write Kiki, was because I'd read them all and I'd seen the television show so many times, and it just wasn't any more Phryne. And so I'm like, you have to write your own Phryne, Tessa, if you want more.
That's lovely.
So I did.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Look, we're starting to run out of time, so just circling around from the beginning, where you began, if you were starting out all over again, is there anything you would change? You're probably early enough in your career that you're still very much involved in how it's going, but is there anything even at this point that you'd look back on and think, I wish I had done that rather than that?
I wish I had started earlier.
Oh,
that's probably the only thing I would say, because to change things is to regret what you've done, but this kind of life is so serendipitous, and you never know if you're going to be published at 20 or 60 and what's going to happen, and are people going to like your books when they're published or not until you're dead. You never really know. You just have to keep going.
Yes.
But I wish I'd had more belief in my storytelling ability when I was younger. I ignored signs like for my, final year of high school, I did drama, obviously, because I wanted to be an actress. I couldn't possibly decide what monologue to pick from Shakespeare or Chekhov, so I wrote my own. It seemed easier for me to write my own than to choose something from Shakespeare. And it wasn't until I'm like 30 that I'm like, look, you've been writing for decades, but I had I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
I had no faith in my ability to do that. And it's like, I wish I'd seen that earlier and started some of the early training where you have to just write so much bad work in order to get to something, to get to an understanding of how writing works.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be the only thing I would say.
Yeah. And what is next for Tessa the writer?
Two things. I'm writing the second book of Kiki Button. So she's still in Paris, but she has a lot to do with exiled Romanovs from the Russian Revolution, taxi driving Russian princes and British princes and all the things that they get up to. And I'm also writing a book set in World War I with someone that's like Kiki's mad doppelganger, and looking at the final year of that war.
Goodness, yeah.
And those, as I mentioned before, those ideas of loss and redemption from loss.
So this is Fox, is it? Is this a kind of development on the Fox character in April?
No. Fox is just for that series.
Yeah.
No, initially when I thought of Kiki, she wasn't Kiki. She was a different kind of person altogether, and it was a book set in World War I that was also funny and a romance and a tragedy and a series and a this and a that. The idea was just far too big. It didn't fit into one book.
Yes.
So I split it in two. One was the series writing romance that's also humorous, and that became Kiki, and the other that looked at World War I and ideas of loss and more those ideas of history and identity and memory. And I was writing both simultaneously, and then it got to a point where Kiki was just working so much better. So I finished that.
Yes.
And that's been published.
Yes. Yeah.
And now I'm also continuing on with the other half of the original Kiki book.
Yes.
Which is the World War I book.
And when are you hoping Kiki 2 will be out?
I don't know. Hopefully next year.
Yes.
So fingers crossed.
Yes.
I don't want people to forget about her in the meantime.
No.
But we'll have to see.
That's right.
We'll have to see.
Yeah.
There are too many people making decisions on that.
Yes.
For me to be able to say.
Yeah. Look, our time really has run out now, and I'm sorry about that because it's been fascinating. But coming to an end, where can readers find you online, and do you like to interact with your readers?
I very much like to interact with my readers. People can message me anytime. I have a website, tessalunney.com. I'm on Twitter, and my handle is Tessa Wynn, Wynn. And Tessa Wynn is also one of my Instagram accounts. And I have another Instagram account just for Kiki called Miss Kiki Button, where you can find me as well. And there will be coming a Facebook author page where you'll also be able to find me, and you can interact me on any of those platforms. I'd love to hear from you.
That's lovely, Tessa. Look, thank you so much. It's been fabulous talking, and you really have made that period of Paris in the 20s come alive in your book. So we're looking forward to the next one.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Joys of Binge Reading podcast. You can find all the details and links for this episode at www.thejoysofbingereading.com. We'd love to hear your comments and suggestions for who you'd like us to interview next. And if you enjoyed the show, take a moment to subscribe on iTunes or a similar provider so you won't miss out on future guests. Thanks for joining us, and happy reading.
The Joys of Binge Reading podcast is put together with fantastic technical help from Dan Cotton and Abe Raffles. Dan is an experienced sound and video engineer who's ready and available to help you with your next project. Seek him out at dcaudioservices@gmail.com. That's D for Daniel, C for Charlie, audioservices@gmail.com, or check our show notes. He's fast, he takes pride in getting it right, and he's great to work with. Our voiceovers are done by Abe Raffles, another gem of sound and screen. Abe has 20 years of experience on both sides of the camera/microphone, as a cameraman director and also as a voice artist and TV presenter. I think you'd agree that his voice is both light-hearted and warm. He is super easy to work with no matter what the job. You'll find him at Abe, A-B-E, at pointandshoot.co.nz. As I say, the full details in the show notes on the website. That's it for now. Thanks for listening. Hopefully see you next week. Bye.